In a fraction of a second, the pressure inside a sealed steel chamber on the Byford Dolphin fell from 9 atmospheres to 1. 4 men were living inside that chamber at the crushing pressure of the deep sea, and the collapse was so fast that none of them had time to feel it. Bergersen, a tender standing at the coupling out on the open deck, was killed in the very same instant, and a 6th man standing only a single step away from him somehow lived. It happened at around 4 in the morning on the 5th of November 1983, in the freezing Norwegian North Sea. By the time anyone on the rig understood what had gone wrong, 5 men were dead. And a procedure that had been carried out safely 1,000 times had become one of the worst diving accidents in history. This is the story of the Byford Dolphin, of the coupling that let go while 9 atmospheres were still locked inside, and of the 1 man at the heart of it who walked away. To understand how 6 men ended up in that situation, you have to go back to what the North Sea had become. In the 1970s and 1980s, the cold water between Britain and Norway turned into one of the biggest energy frontiers on Earth. Oil and gas sat deep beneath the seabed, and enormous fortunes depended on reaching them. The risks went up faster than the rules that were meant to govern them, and the men who did the most dangerous work of all were the divers. Not sport divers with a single tank on their backs, but commercial saturation divers, among the most specialized and most exposed workers in the world. The North Sea in those years was one of the deadliest workplaces in Europe. Storms tore at the platforms, machinery crushed limbs, and the cold could finish a man in minutes. But the divers carried a danger the deck crews never touched, and that danger was pressure itself. The gas fields lay far below the surface in permanent cold and permanent dark. To do any work down there, a diver's body had to be brought to the same pressure as the seabed, and then held at that pressure. That is what saturation means. The body's tissues absorbing the breathing gas until they can hold no more. Once a diver is fully saturated, bringing him back to normal pressure, a process called decompression, can take many days. You cannot do that at the end of every shift. So the industry chose a harder path. It simply kept the divers under pressure the whole time for weeks on end, without ever bringing them up. They lived inside sealed steel chambers bolted to the deck of the rig. Life in saturation is life shrunk down to almost nothing. The divers slept, ate, and waited inside chambers barely wider than a hallway. Their breathing gas was rich in helium, so their voices came out thin and squeezed, and the surface crew listened through electronic unscramblers just to understand them. Warm water was pumped through their suits when they worked, because at that depth the cold could kill faster than almost anything else. They were husbands and fathers and sons, doing a job that paid well for the simple reason that it asked for everything. And all of it ran on one thing, which was trust. The divers handed their lives completely to the men on the deck who controlled the pressure around them. The Byford Dolphin was a semi-submersible drilling rig, a floating platform standing on massive submerged legs. In the autumn of 1983, it was working the Frigg gas field on the Norwegian side of the North Sea. Bolted to its deck was a saturation diving system that worked like a sealed maze of pressure. The divers lived in a set of connected steel chambers held at the same pressure as the depth where they were working. That night, the whole system was pressurized to 9 atmospheres, 9 times the weight of the air at the surface, pressing on everything at once. When it was time to work, the divers moved out of their living chamber and into a diving bell. The bell was a small round capsule that could be lowered to the seabed and hauled back up while keeping its pressure sealed inside. Between the living chambers and the bell ran a short connecting tunnel that the crew called the trunk. But heavy steel clamp locked the bell onto that trunk, and sealed doors separated each section from the next picture. A chain of airlocks, each one holding back a force that could kill in seconds if it were ever released in the wrong order. The rule that kept everyone alive was simple, and it was absolute. You never release the clamp between the bell and the chambers until the pressure on both sides has been equalized and the inner door is shut. Break that rule while the system is still pressurized, and a single coupling is all that stands between the men and the full force of the deep sea on the deck. That coupling was the responsibility of the dive tenders. The tenders were not divers themselves, but the divers' lives ran straight through their hands. Their job was to read the gauges, work the clamps, handle the bell, and make certain the pressure was where it should be before any lock was ever touched. That night, 2 tenders were on the deck running the operation. One of them was named Crammond, an experienced hand who was working the bell that morning. The second tender stood close beside him, a single step from the same clamp. Those two men, side by side at the coupling, would end the night in completely different worlds. Inside the pressurized system were 4 divers. Their names were Coward, Lucas, Bergersen, and Hellevik. 2 of them had just come back from the bell after a shift in the water, tired and ready to rest. The other 2 were in the living chamber waiting. Hellevik was the diver closest to the inner door, the door between the trunk and the living chambers. In a few minutes, that one position would matter more than anyone could have imagined. These were not reckless men. They were among the most highly trained workers in the entire North Sea, people who understood pressure better than almost anyone alive. They had done this exact procedure, coming in from the bell for the night more times than they could count. Every one of them knew the rule about the clamp by heart, and every one of them was depending, at 4 in the morning, on that rule being followed exactly. It was the most routine moment of the whole operation, which is precisely what made it so dangerous. Saturation shifts ran around the clock, and 4 in the morning was just another working hour in a world that never saw daylight. The bell had been in the water, the divers had done their work, and now it was time to bring them in and shut the operation down for the night. The correct sequence was fixed, and every tender knew it in their sleep. First, the bell is mated to the trunk and locked in place with the clamp. Then the divers climb out of the bell, through the trunk, and into the living chambers. Next, the inner door between the trunk and the chamber is closed and sealed tight. Only then is the trunk slowly vented down from 9 atmospheres to normal pressure. And only after the trunk is empty of pressure is the clamp finally released, so the bell can be lifted safely away. Every step depended on the one before it. But skip a step or take them out of order and the whole chain of airlocks collapses at once. There was no automatic system to stop that from happening. There was no interlock, no fail-safe, nothing to physically prevent the clamp from being opened at the wrong moment. There were only tired men, hand signals, and a procedure they trusted with their lives. And on that night, at that hour, at the very last step, something in that chain went wrong. The exact sequence of those final seconds has been argued over for decades, but the physical facts are not in dispute. The clamp between the bell and the trunk was released while the system was still pressurized to 9 atmospheres. And while the inner door had not yet been sealed in that instant, there was nothing left to hold the pressure in. The trunk and the chambers were still full of the deep sea's force, and suddenly they were opened to the ordinary air of the deck. 9 atmospheres does not leak away politely. It escaped in a single violent rush far faster than the eye could follow. The diving bell was blown off the trunk like a cork from a bottle, hurled across the deck with terrible force. Crammond, the tender standing at the coupling, was struck and killed in that same fraction of a second inside the system. The 4 divers were exposed to a pressure drop so sudden and so extreme that survival was physically impossible. The human body can adjust to pressure slowly over hours and days, but it cannot survive losing all of it in a fraction of a second. Coward, Lucas, and Bergersen died instantly, before any of them could even have understood what was happening. For them, there was no pain and no warning, only a world that ended between one heartbeat and the next. Hellevik, the diver at the inner door, was caught directly in the path of all that escaping pressure forced against the narrow gap of the partly open hatch. The force that funneled out through that small opening was beyond anything a human body is built to withstand. And like the others, he was gone in an instant. In less time than it takes to say their names, 4 divers and 1 tender were dead. And then there was the second tender. He had been standing only a step from Crammond, right beside the coupling when it let go. The same blast that killed the man next to him caught him as well and threw him across the deck. He was badly hurt, but he was alive. By pure position, by a difference of a single step and a few degrees of angle, he had lived where everyone around him had died. He was the only person at the very heart of the accident to survive it. He would carry the injuries and the memory of that morning. For the rest of his life, he is the reason. This is a story with a survivor at all. Much of what we understand about how fast it happened and how little warning there was, we owe in part to the man who lived through it. But in those first minutes on the deck, survival did not feel like luck. The rig went silent in the way that only a place after a sudden disaster can. One moment there had been the ordinary noise of a night operation, and the next there was wreckage and stillness. The diving bell lay where the blast had thrown it. The chamber system that had been a sealed living world seconds earlier was now open and quiet. The crew who ran to help found a scene that no training could have prepared them for. There was nothing anyone could do for the 5 men who had died. There had been no time to save them, and there had been no warning to act on. The one thing the crew could do was get the surviving tender help and hold the rig together through the rest of that long night. Word went back to shore, to the companies, and eventually to 5 families who were still asleep. For those families, the 5th of November 1983 would divide their lives into before and after. When the shock began to settle, the questions started. How could a routine procedure done safely thousands of times kill 5 men in a single instant? The bodies were recovered and examined, and the autopsies told a plain clinical story. They confirmed what the physics already suggested, that the men had died instantly from the catastrophic loss of pressure. The findings were so extreme that they later became part of the medical and scientific literature on what explosive decompression does to the human body. But knowing how the men had died did not answer the harder question of why the clamp had been opened at all. And that question turned out to have no simple answer. The first official investigation focused on the actions of the men on the deck. Its conclusion leaned toward human error, the idea that the clamp had been released out of sequence before the door was sealed and the trunk was vented. In the cold language of a report, the accident became a mistake made by the very men who had died in it. For years, that was the version that stood. But it never sat right with the people who understood the work, and it never sat right with the families. They kept asking a different question. If a single slip of timing could kill 5 men, then why was there nothing in the system to prevent that slip? Why was there no interlock to stop the clamp from opening while the chambers were still pressurized? Why were men doing this life and death work at 4 in the morning, the end of exhausting shifts, with no automatic safeguard behind them? A later and far more searching review of the disaster reached very different conclusions. It argued that the true cause was not one man's mistake, but the design of the system itself. The equipment had no fail-safe. The procedures relied entirely on human timing, and the working conditions all but guaranteed that sooner or later someone would be caught out in that reading. The men on the deck were not the cause of the disaster. They were the last thin line of defense in a system built to fail, and one night it finally did. The blame that had been laid on the dead began slowly to shift toward the way the whole operation had been built and run. That shift did not happen on its own. It happened because the families refused to let the matter rest. For more than 2 decades, they pushed for the truth and for accountability. They wanted it recognized that their husbands and sons and fathers had not simply made a careless mistake. They wanted it acknowledged that the men had been failed by the equipment and the system around them. It was a long, grinding fight against companies and against time itself. Records were incomplete, years slipped past, and the world moved on to other headlines. But the families did not move on. In the end, more than 25 years after that night, they won a measure of what they had been seeking. A Norwegian commission re-examined the diving accidents of the North Sea's boom years, including the Byford Dolphin. The state acknowledged failings in how the pioneer divers had been protected, and a system of compensation was put in place for the divers and the families who had suffered. It could not bring the men back because nothing could do that. But it was at last an official recognition that the disaster had never really been the fault of the men who died in it. For families who had carried both grief and blame for a quarter of a century, that recognition mattered more than any amount of money. And it was one more legacy, quieter, but just as important. The accident forced the industry to change the way these systems were built. The lesson of the Byford Dolphin was brutally simple. You cannot leave 5 lives resting on one tired man remembering the right order of steps at 4 in the morning. In the years that followed, saturation diving systems were redesigned so that this exact accident could not happen the same way again. Interlocks and fail-safe mechanisms were introduced so that a clamp physically cannot be released while the chambers behind it are still under pressure. The single point of human error that had killed 5 men was engineered out of the system. It is a bitter kind of progress, the kind paid for in advance with lives and only understood afterward. Every diver who has worked safely under one of those redesigned systems since owes something to what was learned on that rig. That is, the strange, hard arithmetic of industrial disasters. The rules that protect the people who come after are very often written in the loss of the people who came before. It is easy decades later to reduce the Byford Dolphin to a diagram of clamps and chambers and pressure, but that is not what it was. It was 4 divers who had trusted a system with their lives, coming in from a night shift, minutes from rest. It was a tender at a coupling doing a job he had done 1,000 times. It was a second tender a single step away who would spend the rest of his life as the man who lived. And it was 5 families on shore whose phones would ring before dawn. The North Sea gave up its fortune. And this was part of the price paid by men whose names most people have never heard. Coward, Lucas, Bergersen, Hellevik, and Crammond were not statistics. They were skilled, ordinary men caught in the last second of a routine that should never have been allowed to kill them. The clamp that failed them has long since been redesigned, but the reason it had to be redesigned should not be forgotten. Because behind every safety rule that seems obvious now, there is usually a night like this one. And men like these, the Byford Dolphin, is remembered today mostly for how horrifying the physics were. But the real story is quieter and sadder than that. It is the story of ordinary skill, ordinary exhaustion, and a single missing safeguard on one ordinary night in the dark. If this story stayed with you, subscribe and stay with the disaster vault, because there is always another forgotten disaster and always someone who lived to tell it.